Yes, a very warm welcome to everybody in the audience and at home as well. And a very warm welcome in the first place to Shane Harris. Welcome at AI at War on AI mass surveillance and cyber warfare, we called it. And we're going to talk about those two and more. Shane Harris, our guest of tonight. Very, very happy you're here. I can't say how excited I am. A topical conversation. It's becoming one of the most influential, most developments in the world. It has been shaping our world to sort of in the utmost way. Yeah. Also, recently we've became aware of that, but you were aware of that already a long time ago. I read At War. Already the fact that it's written at war, and this is more than 10 years old.
Yeah, more than it felt very edgy at the time, yeah.
And the rise of the military internet complex.
Yeah.
And in that period, it might have sounded a little bit like science fiction still, but now it's all over us, and it's shaping our world. So I'm very, very glad that you made it from Washington to here. You're a Pulitzer-winning journalist, author who's written about security, intelligence, and foreign policy for more than 2 decades. Staff writer at The Atlantic at the moment, where you write on the Trump administration, the U.S. national security situation, the international security situation. You co-wrote first already Signal. You co-wrote the publications in Signalgate stories after the White House National Security Advisor inadvertently added your chief editor.
That's right.
To a Signal group.
He did, yeah.
He did.
By accident, yeah. It was a great gift, journalistically.
A great gift? In what respect?
I mean, it's great material. How long does often is classified information from the Secretary of Defense land in your lap and get delivered into your phone? Usually journalists like me spend a lot of time trying to convince people to give us information. They don't just accidentally send it to us. Yeah. But it was a thrill to do that story, yeah.
I was a bit disappointed that your chief editor volunteered to say that he was in there.
I was actually, I remember the night that he pulled himself out of the room. This is Jeff Goldberg, and he decided to leave the chat. And I've since joked with him and said, if that had been me in the chat instead of you, you would have had to pull me off the wall. And you threatened to fire me unless I leave. But he decided it was the right thing to do. And at the end of the day, we found this out many months later, that after he left the chat room, the chat kind of stopped anyway. So we feel like we didn't miss too much. Yeah, which is a shame.
Yeah. You do agree on that, because you are an investigative journalist.
Yes, yes.
Before and foremost.
Yeah. I mean, I go out and I try to find answers to questions that people are the burning questions or ones they haven't thought to ask, and I get people to tell me things that they're probably not supposed to tell me. That is the job.
Yeah. When I became a journalist, when I was in my early 20s, Bob Woodward, all the president's man.
Yep, sure.
I remember, pulling it out of the shelf of my parents' book shelf and reading it and getting all excited and wow, when I was a young boy. And now you were here and I got the same feeling.
Well, appreciate that. I got nervous around Bob Woodward the first time I met him too, because he was sort of like working at the Washington Post for 7 years. He kind of is this larger-than-life sort of presence.
You worked at the Washington Post.
Yeah, exactly, before the Atlantic. Yeah. But, but you mentioned, investigative journalists like that. I'm sure this is true for you and for so many of us in this profession. The Watergate era was like, the high watermark in so many ways of great investigative journalism, and it produced so many terrific reporters, and getting to work around some of them was a real thrill. But it's a tradition that gets handed down, and you learn it from people who did it before you. And we're fortunate that for as much as the U.S. media system is under tremendous strain right now as a business model, there's still robust investigative reporting that goes on in American journalism. And I'm happy to say that I've been lucky enough to work at places that value that and want to invest in that.
We had coffee before the weekend, briefly, and you said that you're still into the trade of sitting at the end of a bar and drinking a whiskey with a deep throat. Is that really true?
I joke that I do my best work on a bar stool, and it's because my job is you have to go meet people. You try to do it discreetly many times. The image of like where Bob Woodward was meeting in a parking garage with deep throat. There's still a little bit of those things that go on, but by and large, most of it's done above ground for the most part. But the nature of the job is that you have to build trust with people. You have to build personal rapport with people. It's not the kind of job where you can just sort of call somebody up on the phone and ask them an answer and expect them to tell you their life story and then you hang up or they give you the information you want. You have to build a bond with many of these people. And sometimes they're people who you might find personally very disagreeable, or maybe they don't like you very much, but they want to tell you their story because there's something in it for them. And I like that aspect of reporting. It is a human profession. It is a tactile profession. At the Washington Post, we had these signs up around the room that Marty Barron, who was the editor at the time when I was there, who, if you've seen the movie Spotlight, he's the main editor of the Boston Globe during their investigation of sex abuse by the Catholic Church. And he had these signs up, and it sounds so simple, and they just said, "Go talk to people." With a finger, like pointing, like metaphorically towards the door or towards the person.
Yeah, which is not the coffee machine.
Yeah, exactly. Put the phone down, get out from behind your desk and go talk to people. And that is just fundamentally what the job is about. And you can't do investigative reporting unless you're willing to do that.
Would you be able to say what makes you successful talking to people? Do you have a trick or a trade?
You should ask my husband.
We will.
Yeah, bring him up here and ask him.
Yeah.
You know, it's so interesting. It's like, so I was a very shy kid growing up, but I was always very curious. And I was sort of like the kid that often liked to ask why. And, you know, when I warmed up to people and I found conversation was just something that kind of came naturally to me. So maybe there's something about that. One of the things that I don't know if it's a trick or not, but and I try to tell this to young journalists too, is you have to learn how to just listen really, really well. And sometimes, you know, I'm doing a lot of talking now, but most of my job is just sitting there listening to people. And when I was in high school and then I was in college as well, I did a lot of theater. And did a lot of acting. And one of the first things they train you as an actor is active listening. Like, how do you sit there and listen to your scene partner, hear what he's saying, and then respond to it so that it feels authentic, it feels like reality. And I think there was something in that helped me, of just knowing that if you just open up your ears and close your mouth, sometimes people will start talking and say the most amazing things. And people want to be heard. And so I think that there's something about maybe that getting out of my shell a little bit from when I was a shy kid to getting into theater that became useful. That was part of it, probably. Yeah.
Being able to listen and to make people believe that you're listening.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Including sometimes when they're not telling you what you want them to tell you, or when it's boring, or they won't get to the point. But not rushing them and letting them do it in their own time. I mean, you have to let them tell their story, and that can actually be a really gratifying experience in itself when people start to open up to you. It's very human and it's really moving, and I'm kind of a sentimentalist too, so maybe that's another reason why I like it.
Are you? Okay. Thank you for talking a little bit about investigative journalism, which is sort of an old love of mine. But tonight we touch upon questions concerning U.S. military complex and the battlefield, and how both are changing, and how these changes might trickle down into our civilian European lives, or lives in the Middle East, or Americans. But again, thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for being here. Thanks to Veefonds for generous support of this evening, making this evening possible. And thank you for flying over here. There's just 2 or 3 remarks. This talk will be on the internet, so be aware of that. There's always question time at the end. If you don't want to be seen on the internet, don't ask questions. And switch off your phone from the active sort of. Don't make any noise. You can Twitter along, of course, if you want. But we first gonna listen to you, then we have our conversation, and you, as always, you can join in afterwards at the end with questions. Just a short reminder, questions, are Dutch or English. Actually, an English sentence, which goes up a little bit towards the end and has a question mark at the end. But that will be later on. Now I invite you to take the lectern, and thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, great. Well, thank you everyone for coming out, and thank you to the Balie. It's such an honor to be here, really it is. And I'm grateful to Yuri and to all of your colleagues for bringing me here, and to all of you for coming out and being interested in what I have to say. So like I said, usually I'm the one who's listening, so I'll try not to abuse your patience as I talk a little bit here tonight. But you know, sometimes we have this joke in journalism about the news gods are smiling, right? Which is like, you know, when something just comes along at just the right moment for a discussion or for coverage. And on the topic of AI, we're actually having one of these right now, because if you follow artificial intelligence or AI, you may be aware of something very interesting that happened in the past several days with a company called Anthropic, which makes this thing called Claude, which some of you may know about, and something very interesting that Claude started doing that they didn't plan for. And I'll get to that in the remarks, and maybe we'll dig into this a little bit more in the discussion. But this is like the perfect time to be having this discussion. So I'm really happy about that. But before I sort of get into like the current state of the art and where we are now, I wanted to actually rewind the clock quite a bit to talk a little bit about the first time that I ever heard a term that we would now recognize as being associated with AI, or artificial intelligence, right? And if you're in this room, you probably know what AI is generally, but the term that I heard was machine learning, which maybe if you follow AI, this is something that resonates with you, this idea of a computer that essentially kind of learns as it goes and teaches itself, for lack of a better term, right? To use the analogy, as opposed to somebody programming the machine to do certain things. And the first time I heard this term was actually in 2002. So it was 24 years ago now, and I was a very young reporter covering the technology space and also the intelligence community, which I started covering really after the 9/11 attacks. Because it was very interesting in the United States and in the US government. After 9/11, technology companies were the ones that came rushing in towards the government and saying, basically, you have a data problem, right? You have all this information you're collecting about terrorists and bad guys, and nobody's putting it all together for you, and you don't know which database you've got which information stored about which terrorist group. And you know, before 9/11, basically, all these intelligence agencies in our incredibly sophisticated intelligence system weren't really talking to one another. And so nobody was really connecting the dots about these plots that were being executed against the United States or planned. So tech companies came in and said, we can solve this problem for you. So it was kind of in that spirit that I started covering these intelligence agencies, of which, by the way, at the time, as like a 26-year-old reporter, I knew nothing about. Right? I mean, I barely understood what the CIA was, what the FBI was. I'd never heard of the National Security Agency. So all these agencies that would then consume a quarter century of my life were pretty new to me. And in 2002, I was interviewing people of all places at the Defense Department, and specifically this organization called DARPA, which you may have heard of. It stands for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And DARPA is sort of like the futuristic think tank inside the Pentagon. It is generally credited with inventing the internet. The early internet was something called ARPANET, which was a network of computers used by people who worked in association with the Defense Department. So I went over for this interview one day with these people working at DARPA, and they were developing this project where they wanted to basically use modern technology to harness all these huge amounts of information that were out there that would tell them patterns of activity to look for if you were trying to stop a terrorist attack. So things like airline reservation databases, email databases, financial transactions, hotel records, all the stuff that was out there in the digital space, which even now sounds a little creepy and a little scary. At the time sounded incredibly scary and new, because we did not have systems that tied these things together in a big surveillance network, which is kind of what we have now and sort of analogous to that. So they said they really wanted to invest in new technology that would do this for the government. And they called this program Total Information Awareness, which again, pretty creepy name, but kind of gets at the idea. And now you hear something like total information awareness and you're like, yeah, big data, right? Yeah, just run AI against it and figure it out. That's what they were talking about back then. And there was really no vocabulary for this at the time. And at the time, this was so novel that they didn't even know whether the companies that could actually develop the kinds of technologies they wanted to build, whether they existed or whether there was a market for this stuff. So that was my introduction to, I think, what we would now call AI. And this term machine learning just kind of kept popping up. And I'm like, what's that? And it really was sort of cutting edge beyond cutting edge. It was so new and so early that it wasn't even really being discussed, it seemed to me, like really outside of the government and confines like that. So that program was very short-lived and it was stopped over privacy concerns. The work was then picked up again and put in the classified budgets of the US intelligence community and developed over time. I wrote a book about much of it that came out in 2010. You know about much of this stuff now because a guy named Edward Snowden in 2013 leaked a ton of documents, and the stuff that you saw in those documents was basically the aftermath of the stuff that I was talking to people about when they were talking about AI in the year 2002. So there really has been just sort of this evolution in this technology that we see now that's in all of our lives. And much of it is rooted in the US government, in the Defense Department, in the Pentagon, which prepares for and plans for war and fights war, in the intelligence agencies that go out and try and detect attacks before they're happening, that try to know things before other people know them. And I've always had that in my mind when I think about AI, is like the roots go back to when I was this young reporter and writing about the government. I think today a lot of the privacy concerns that were around things like total information awareness, they almost seem kind of quaint now, because I think our whole notion of privacy has actually changed a lot. Maybe we'll talk about that in discussion. I don't think it means the same thing as it did in 2002 to most people. But to really sort of then position where we are now, in that same department that I was talking to people in 24 years ago, now the Defense Department spends about $13 billion a year just on AI programs. That's what's budgeted for the current fiscal year. The year before, if you add in other programs associated with AI, the budget was $25.2 billion. That's probably an undercount because this only accounts for what's in the unclassified budget in the United States. What goes on in the classified budget, so the intelligence agencies, other things that the Pentagon does in what's sometimes called the black budget, is probably vastly more than that. And this is also still only about 3% of the total defense budget, which is pretty huge. But the DoD is this massive accelerator of artificial intelligence right now. And I find that just fascinating. And you're seeing it obviously in the commercial sector, and the private sector is huge too. But the military's interest in AI probably there's more interest in that technology than I would say any other technology by a mile. And the DoD has been pretty open about what they're doing with this stuff. They have divided it into sort of three categories. One is they use AI for administrative tasks. I mean, it's like writing memos, drafting policy documents, probably a lot of the same way you use a chatbot or an LLM at work maybe, or maybe you're not supposed to in the job that you have. They're using it for that, but it's also being used for intelligence analysis. So kind of going back to 2002 when I was interviewing these people saying we have all this data and a human being can't possibly process it. That's what AI is used for now. And it is very much embedded, I think, into the way that intelligence analysts do their work, and that goes in the military as well. And then the third piece, and I think is what we'll probably talk a lot about tonight, involves combat operations and warfare. So AI being used for command and control, for decision making, for planning, for logistics, for weapons systems, and for cyber warfare. And increasingly, there's a huge debate and question around whether or not we want to use these AI systems for what we call autonomous warfare, which is to say a drone that goes out, flies around on its own, decides what to blow up or who to kill. The technology is here to do that right now. I think a lot of my time as a reporter, and particularly writing about technology, you're always writing about what does the future look like, what's around the corner. The future's now, it's here. I mean, AI is fundamentally a piece and a part of how the intelligence agencies in the United States do their job, how the military fights wars. It's kind of a rough count, but the best estimates are probably that there are about 850 separate initiatives or programs just in the Pentagon using AI. I mean, it is basically how they do business now. Pete Hegseth, the guy you may have heard of, who likes to be called the Secretary of War. I still call him the Secretary of Defense because the name has not been legally changed. He said in January 26 in an AI strategy memo, quote, "We must accept that the risks of not moving fast enough with AI outweigh the risks of imperfect alignment." And alignment is a term that AI engineers will often use, which basically means, in so many ways, like make sure the thing doesn't get out of control and kill us. and become smarter than we are. So that's the Secretary of Defense basically saying, put the pedal to the metal, go as fast as you can, don't turn around, don't stop. That's a huge driver of this technology right now, and something that I find really kind of breathtaking. So if you want, we get into this maybe more in the discussion, but if you want an example of where we are right now in the terms of the state of the art of how AI is used in combat, you're actually seeing it on TV right now or reading about it in the papers. And it's the US and Israel led war in Iran. So in the first 24 hours of the US operation in Iran, which the Pentagon calls Operation Epic Fury, the Pentagon identified 1,000 potential targets, things on the ground to hit from the air, to bomb, in 24 hours. If that sounds like a lot, it's a huge lot. To generate that many targets in a day, a human being could never do that. And a human being could never look at satellite photos, intelligence reports, listen to signals intercepts, all the different intelligence inputs that go into selecting what is the thing that we're going to go blow up and attack. You could never do 1,000 of those in a day. AI can do in seconds what it would take humans hours to do. That's where we are right now, is we are letting machines select these targets. And we'll talk about how much humans are actually still in the loop on that and making decisions, and whether you even can make decisions at that speed. But I find that just fascinating that, again, this is not theoretical technology. It's happening every day, and we can watch it and you can sort of see the effects of it. The technology is more powerful, I think, and more mysterious than we understand, and the people who are designing it seem to understand. Having written for 25 years around about technology, the thing about AI that strikes me the most, and frankly is the most alarming, is when you talk to AI researchers and developers, they can't exactly tell you why it works. They don't exactly know what's going on inside the neural networks or inside the model. And I can't really think of a technology in which the people who built it don't exactly know how it works and why it does what it does. And AI researchers will often say, they don't even use the term built the AI model. They like to say that the AI models are grown, like something in a garden that kind of just evolves on its own from the weather and the soil and maybe a little watering. And even that's maybe misleading because we know how plants grow. That's not a mystery. But these are not things that are being built in the classic way we think of software or anything, something mechanical being built. And so this kind of gets around to why Anthropic is back in the news in the past few days. The models that they have been building, and Claude is the one that people are most familiar with, start to do things sometimes that they didn't anticipate as the next model is kind of grown or iterated. And what the people at Anthropic have said that they found was the most recent model of Claude actually was very, very good at identifying vulnerabilities in software programs, right? The things that hackers can go attack, which sounds great. We'll run Super Claude against our computer systems and find out where all the people they're vulnerable to being hacked, except it had this one flip side, which is it's also really good at hacking and attacking those systems. And it's really good at developing the exploits or the tools to go out and break into systems. So in other words, we accidentally grew a hacker who operates on AI. And we didn't mean to. But it kind of happened, right? I mean, that's essentially what Anthropic has been saying. And they decided that this most recent version of the model was so potentially dangerous that they didn't want to release it publicly. And they've let 40 large organizations basically experiment with it and tell them how it works. This is either a really great marketing gimmick to make everybody really excited about your new product, or it's really scary. I tend to lean more towards the scary piece of it because, when I was writing about cyber warfare 10 years ago in this book and it sounded like science fiction, this was kind of the science fiction-y piece of it, right? That you would develop technology that moved faster and was smarter than the hackers, and you would just automate hacking and automate cyber warfare and espionage, essentially. It sort of sounds like that's what Anthropic may have just built. And that was only a few days ago that we found out about that. So It's an incredibly exciting time as a journalist. It's an incredibly alarming time as a person alive in the world. I like writing about these subjects for exactly those reasons, that they are challenging intellectually, politically, morally, everything that you could kind of want, I think, as a journalist who's trying to do investigative work, but also sort of tried to explain the times that we're living in. So hopefully we'll do some more of that in the discussion. These are interesting times, and they are moving very, very fast. It's hard to pay attention and to follow all of it, but I'm very grateful to all of you for coming out as we try and get our hands around some of it. So thanks.
Thank you, Shane Harris, for this introduction, which points to why we think it's good to invite you and talk about it. You put it, I mean, there's so many inroads in what you just said. Let's get back to the total information awareness and sort of the prehistory of what you described, 2002, and move on from there a little bit. But so could we say that this comes that most of this weaponization of AI and that it came about is actually the need for surveillance after the attacks on the Twin Towers?
I think from the government's perspective, that has a huge amount to do with it. They might not recognize it that way now because their need for surveillance and kind of automation has taken on new requirements. But this is really where it all begins, I think. You know, it's after 9/11, there is this immediate, almost immediate, really, recognition that all of these very powerful intelligence agencies weren't talking to one another.
No.
You know, you had this kind of like one of the most shocking examples is that the CIA was monitoring a group of Al-Qaeda suspects in Europe, and when they crossed into the United States, nobody from the intelligence agencies told the FBI that they were here. And the FBI handles the domestic part, and the CIA handles the foreign part. So you just had the left and right hand not talking to one another. And you got to remember, too, early 2000s, it's the dot-com era. The internet is going to change everything. People talked about the internet the way we talk about AI now. And these tech companies came to the government and said, you have a problem with information, and we think we can help you fix it. And there was no greater imperative than stopping another terrorist attack. I mean, it's 9/11 was just one of those encompassing events like the pandemic where it just grabbed a hold of every part of society. And so, yeah, the government was, and they became intensely interested in then using technology to go out and find suspected terrorists, and in many cases go out and find them and kill them. They got very good at the manhunting business, and surveillance technology was a key piece of that as well.
Yeah, because they realized that, you know, had they known that there were guys, you know, trying to learn how to fly airplanes into big buildings, if they would have known, they would have been able to stop it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And they just didn't connect the dots, as you just called it. Yeah. And so, would you go as far as to think that 9/11 in that respect was a big business opportunity for the Silicon Valley guys?
Huge. In fact, it's interesting. At the time of 9/11, you're sort of in what the dot-com bubble is bursting. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these, you know, we remember these websites, you know, at least we had them in the US, like, you know, pets.com, and everything was a .com. And it was going to change how we bought things on the internet.
Yeah,
right?
It was going to bring heaven on earth.
Exactly,
right? Yeah.
Exactly. And then all these companies just sort of imploded because, you know, they were overvalued and it was hyped. And so a lot of these big tech companies actually then looked at the government after 9/11 and said, wow, okay, there's a place that spends billions of dollars a year on technology. Let's go sell our stuff to them. And so I remember, like, even in these early days, there were these big tech companies that used to have these sort of like huge, you know, user events in Silicon Valley where they'd come out on the stage and things like this, you know, and they'd have the big parties and whatnot, and they're really hyping the product. They just did versions of that in Washington or for government people.
For Ministry of Defense people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And they sort of, and there's a long history of big, innovative, you know, technology coming out of government. What a lot of these smaller companies found was that the government market was dominated by a lot of these large entrenched contractors, sometimes called Beltway bandits, because Beltway goes around DC. And the ones who sort of, you know, the Raytheons, the Lockheed Martins, whatever.
The hardware guys.
Yeah, exactly, the hardware guys.
Lockheed Martin, those Boeing.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe,
Yeah, and so a lot of these smaller companies found it hard to break through. A lot of them got purchased by bigger companies. And then some of the more smaller, innovative companies did manage to break through after 10 or so years. One of whom, which maybe we'll talk about, was a then very small company I wrote about maybe about 12 years ago called Palantir. Which now everyone knows what Palantir is. There were companies like that said, wait a second, there's a commercial application for our technology, but these people over in the government absolutely need the kind of stuff we build, and they will pay a lot for it because it's mission critical for them.
Yeah, yeah. Early sort of state capture.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the government needs those companies to build it. They don't build their own stuff. They hire people to build it.
That's interesting to go into that a little bit, because so it's the private companies who actually build it and own it?
So if you have a technology and you sell it to the government, you have a contract with them to sell, a lot of times sell this as a service, right? So let's say you're Palantir. I mean, essentially the government buys the license to use it, and it comes with access to the technology and the people who will come run it for you. But generally speaking, it's not that they're selling it to the government; it's that they're contracting with the government. When Anthropic got into this recent fight with the Pentagon over how it wanted the Pentagon to use or not use its technology, they were essentially, I think, arguing over the terms of a contract.
Yeah.
But the government doesn't really, it doesn't build its own stuff per se. And even, and it's happened in the past 20 years, I would say, that there's a real push away there has been from trying to build it on your own when the private sector, which is filled with innovation, can do it better than you can. And so let the private sector do it, and we will go out and buy access to it. We'll buy licenses to it.
Yeah, so in many ways, what the secret services were doing are several private companies doing now.
Yeah.
Because if this targeting, for instance, you just described, there are many. Let's stick to surveillance for a moment. But the government is not doing that themselves. I mean, they're buying access to the data of private companies.
They buy access to data. In some cases, they buy access to the technology, and then they use the technology. In some cases, they may have engineers from the companies sitting in their government offices helping them use it. And so Palantir uses this model of something called a forward deployed engineer, which basically is a fancy way of saying the guy who knows how to use Palantir or the girl who knows how to use Palantir. And they come and they sit with you and they help you run it. And then people can be trained on it. But I think, in the case of AI, though, I mean, this is something that's just being, Claude is, for instance, authorized to be used on classified government networks. So if you have access to Claude and you're working at the Pentagon, it's no different than if you have, Claude on your desktop at work. It practically looks just the same. You pay for it, you subscribe to it. The government is essentially subscribing to it. It's a different term of a contract. But it's not like they own the technology. They didn't develop it. They're users like everyone else is.
Yeah, so in a way, the spies got obsolete.
Well, it's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, so there are some things, though, that the spies can do that the companies can't, right? So if you're, stick with the technology for a second. So the National Security Agency, which is this is the one that Snowden kind of revealed.
And it's sort of the cupola over many of those.
Yeah, it's the National
services.
Security Agency does electronic surveillance, basically. It's what's called signals intelligence that used to be capturing information as it bounced off a satellite or transited a telephone line or a fiber optic cable. And now we're talking, it's email, it's text messages, it's any kind of electronic, piece of information, essentially. There are technologies, now they will develop some on their own using commercial technology in conjunction as well. But what they have is the legal authority to go out and do surveillance. Yeah. Right? They have the legal authority to go out and, in certain circumstances, under certain restraints, vacuum up huge amounts of information. From their perspective, the technology is just the tool by which they do that. Yeah. It's the legal authority and the expertise in how to do that that is the thing that the intelligence agencies bring to the table. Similarly, like in the case of the CIA, which is actual spies, right? It's the people on the ground moving around, recruiting people to give them information. That's where you still have human beings on the ground, sure, assisted by technology, but doing the actual work of gathering the information. So the technology from their perspective is really, it's a tool. But I think what you're getting at, which is right, is that these lines can start to blur.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're, Palantir loves to say, we don't go out and collect data. We just give tools to people who go out and collect data, and they sort of
and their agencies or
and they do what
police
they will.
departments. And,
right.
Yeah.
But what a company like Palantir brings you is the power to, if you will, unlock that data, to find things in that data, to find associations, patterns, connections. That is their secret sauce. You take that away from an intelligence agency, you might as well have, I wouldn't say put them out of business, but it's like, cutting off an arm, right? That's how they're very reliant on these technologies. It's why when Anthropic wanted to put limits on what the Defense Department could do with its technology, and particularly with Claude, the Defense Department pushed back and said, you have no right to tell us how to, conduct a war, when we're going to use this technology, when we're not. And the reason that the Pentagon, I think, was so angry at Anthropic about this was that if they took Claude away, all of that technology that's sitting there helping the Defense Department analyze data and pick those 1,000 targets in 24 hours, a big chunk of that just goes out the window. Mm-hmm. So they're dependent on these technologies. It's why Pete Hegseth was so furious at Dario Amodei, the head of Anthropic.
The CEO of Anthropic.
Yeah, for threatening to cut off their access, essentially. It's like, if you do that, you're kind of making it hard for us to do our job to go fight wars. That's the Defense Department's point of view.
Especially if you call the Ministry of War.
Yes, exactly. The name change means
annoying.
A lot.
If you can't conduct a war because you have a company
that is Pete Hegseth's job, is to go fight wars.
Yeah, exactly. So, but to delve a little bit deeper into that, because the military internet complex, it used to be the industrial military complex, that's from the 70s, and we used to be left-wing sort of obsession to fight it. But they might have been very right.
Yeah, I think they were right.
because it's the same with new tools, of course, and it's a huge industry. It's a very profitable industry, but you say the confines or the edges are starting to blur between the one and the other.
Yeah.
So if the Secret Service or the police have the legal authority to delve into, the records of a hotel, who's been, there and not there, and to compare these data from the Hilton Hotel, or whatever, and but the data in there is in the servers and in the surroundings and in the machine of a private company.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
exactly. I mean, it's sort of like, think about it this way. In that instance, that analogy, the information that the government wants is held in private hands, right? The hotel company has it. The government can go with legal authorities and demand that they give it to them, right? They can then, maybe they get access to a lot of it, maybe they get access to some of it. But the data is what they need, right? So when the intelligence agencies are talking about how do we go out and do our job, the data that they need, it resides largely in the private sector.
Yeah.
And what was so frightening to many people about total information awareness in 2002 when it was being proposed was, well, how is the government going to get access to total information? You'd basically have to allow the government to be able to plug into all of the databases that they want, to which the DARPA guys told me, like, well, yeah, that's what we'll do. I mean... They didn't really think this through, maybe, but the essence
that is what they do.
Well, this is essentially what the model is right now when we talk about surveillance. Is it's the government not necessarily having total access to everything all the time, but having access to a huge amount of information that prior to 9/11 the law did not allow. I mean, to give you an example of this, so. Every few years in the US, we have this debate over this rather controversial surveillance law that was essentially, it's an existing law that was amended after 9/11. And what it does is allows the National Security Agency and to some extent other parts of the government, but mainly the NSA, to go out and access huge amounts of what they would call foreign intelligence, which is to say we can go out and capture huge amounts of email traffic or telecommunications traffic overseas. Europe is a big one, kind of all around the world, and kind of bring it back and be able then to analyze this information for signs of security threats. Now, they're supposed to do this not like willy-nilly. They're supposed to say, okay, we have a need for information about ISIS I mean, I think practically speaking, that means like, okay, great, we'll just go gobble up the Middle East telecommunications system, right? I mean, it's a huge amount of information that they can get access to. You bring that back, right? What you then need, if you're the NSA, are the tools to analyze and parse the information, to understand it.
The data.
Right,
Yep.
the data, exactly. But the data is the thing. The data is the stuff that you're capturing now.
Yep.
It's not like, in the Cold War, where the NSA's job was, we want to intercept the communications between, the Russian premier and the head of the Red Fleet, and we're going to do that by monitoring their communications and capturing it off a satellite when it comes down. Now it's give us email, give us this information that's out there, because we don't know necessarily who the targets are if you're talking about terrorists. There's then laws that are supposed to restrict how they deal with that information as it respects U.S. persons. Right? Your emails are in there, they don't care so much about yours. Maybe mine, they're supposed to be a little bit more careful with. There are huge questions and debates over how well they're doing that, over whether they need to have warrants to then go and look at my email if they want to, once they have the information. The law has struggled to catch up with the nature and the reality of the technology for years, and it's always on the back foot with these things. But I think we have, and this is kind of why I called the book The Military Internet Complex, is the intelligence agencies can't do what they do without access to that data, and that data is mostly private. And to give you a sense of how important it is to the NSA, every time this bill comes up for reauthorization, and it's coming up at the end of this year, I think, privacy advocates mostly, who are fighting a losing battle and have been for years, will say it's too much information, it's too much authority, NSA has too much access. And the NSA will say, this one piece of law authorizes us to collect information that is roughly 70%, 70, of what we tell the president every day about global security threats. So you take away this authority, and you might as well poke out one of our eyes. And they always win that debate. They've come close to losing a few times, and really the only times that they tend to give any ground or come close to losing is when the companies themselves actually stand up and sort of say, maybe we're not so comfortable with you having access to our information anymore. This is just a fundamentally different way of doing intelligence gathering than it was during the Cold War. It's entirely reliant on private data.
But that means that your data might be a little bit protected and mine aren't.
Essentially, yeah.
So basically everybody who has a European passport in this audience, there's no
If your information is not protected in the same way under that law the way that mine is.
Yeah.
And there are people who would argue, and I have a lot of sympathy for their point of view, that my information is not sufficiently protected either. Mm-hmm. Because once it comes back into the government database,
so your
they
email
can
to
search
me
it.
then would be open for them to search.
Potentially, right? There are certain limits on what they're allowed to search for and how they do it, but that's all kind of behind a black curtain, and it's hard to know.
And would you say that this is an American phenomena, or are there other countries in the world which sort of approach this state of total surveillance?
I mean, the way that we do it under law, right, is not unique. I mean, I think there are intelligence services in Europe that do this. And again, under law is the key part of this. And what I want to say too, the law is not a fig leaf. It's meaningful. The question is whether it's strong enough. That's always the debate that we're having, and whether it's keeping up with the technology. There are plenty of countries that will be doing this absent any real legal authority. And the question is really not. It's more a question, I guess, not so much about what the law allows, but is what does the technology enable you to do?
And would these countries, regimes, buy the same stuff of these American companies and do it unlawfully in their realm, in their territory, in their...
The companies will probably mostly say, we will only sell this to governments that use it for lawful purposes, mm-hmm. right? Whether that's true or not is a key question. So some years ago, my colleagues and I at the Washington Post did a long project about a Israeli surveillance company called NSO Group. And NSO manufactures a technology that's called Pegasus.
Yeah. And
basically, it's an extremely powerful computer virus, essentially. And its specialty is that it lands on your phone, and embeds itself without you even doing anything. It's called like a no-click exploit is what some people call this. And then they're spying on your phone. Extremely expensive, very hard to make. Government clients would have the ones that have the money to buy this. And what NSO is historically said is we only sell this to countries who are using it for lawful law enforcement purposes. And I think what our investigation showed, and others have as well, is that's not always true. That NSO is selling this to places that are not using this for what we would call lawful investigations. They're spying on journalists. They're using it to spy on dissidents. And there too, it adds this, there's always this interesting dimension of when we talk about surveillance now, is the companies can say, well, we just make the tool. It's up to the government to decide how they're going to use it, and we only sell to lawful governments. But if they break our terms of contract or terms of service, well, that's not really on us. But you have to ask, but isn't it? I mean, you did build the tool. And yes, maybe the government misused it or used it not according to the terms of service, but you built the thing. They did.
And sold it.
And sold it.
Yeah.
And are getting quite rich off it, probably in some cases.
Yeah.
And I find that's to me, is sort of there was a time, I think, where companies could maybe argue a little more credibly or persuasively, don't look at us, we just built the thing, we don't actually tell people how to use it. And I think in the era of AI, particularly when the companies don't even know what the product is doing and how it works, I don't think that explanation is sufficient anymore.
Yeah, because you could say the same thing of the NSO, you could say of Palantir, of course.
Yeah, in many ways, because Palantir will say we only sell it to companies or countries that use it lawfully. Yeah. And they may have a better track record than NSO does, but they will all say that. The question is, how do you know, right? And that's where we depend on whistleblowers and reporters and people trying to investigate that and whether they're actually doing it.
And people drinking a whiskey on the end of the bar with
exactly. Do I buy a drink?
Yeah. And so let's get a little bit to this mysterious part. Where you call it a mysterious black box. And so it's a very powerful tool for surveillance and for warfare. Yeah. Which are connected in sort of a horrible way. You explained a little bit about it. We'll go into that a little bit later, maybe. But actually, they're growing. No, you said growing. Yeah. They're growing programs which they don't entirely understand how they come to conclusions.
Yeah, that's right. And to me, this is just the most alarming thing about AI. And you would think that, that the industry itself would be spending tons of money and putting lots of researchers on figuring out, how does the AI work? How does the model do what it does? Why does it do what it does? And what experts will say, and people I've talked to, is it's basically one of the least funded parts of the whole enterprise, usually. There's not sufficient attention, many people feel, being paid to that. Anthropic, the company, was founded by people who had worked for OpenAI, which makes ChatGPT, because they felt that there were not enough guardrails and safety mechanisms being put into place. So, it's not as though the people building the AIs aren't aware of this problem. I mean, they are. And I think they seem to not know what to do about it. I just find it so alarming because, I can't imagine, when you never listen to an auto manufacturer who said, like, well, I've built this new car, I don't exactly know what makes it run. Maybe sometimes it will want to go left when you want to go right. I wouldn't feel perfectly safe getting in that car. And it's a clunky analogy, I get it, but I just think that when we're talking about the speed of adoption, particularly in the Defense Department, when they're using this technology for lethal decision-making, right? Yeah. That's what they want it for. That's what they're using it for. To not know how it operates and to have it be that mysterious just seems really troubling to me. And it seems like maybe this technology should not be deployed for things like deciding who to kill until you know a little bit more about how it works. Just a crazy idea. But.
So you're, and then it's edged on knowingly by Pete Hegseth and the Ministry of Defense, saying, because you used a very funny word, which you explained, it might not be aligned.
Yeah.
So aligned with not killing us.
Yeah, aligned with, so people in the AI industry or in research will use this term alignment when you're talking about think of it like aligning it with your values might be one way of putting it. But alignment is basically making sure it's doing what you want it to do and not go outside of those guardrails. So, Pete Hegseth's idea of alignment in this context, right? When he says essentially like we don't have time to worry about that, he's saying put those concerns to the side.
Yeah.
What we know is that the AI is great at finding out things to go blow up.
Yeah.
And that's what we need it for.
Yeah.
And the rest of it, put that aside for now.
And why is he in such a hurry? Because he thinks that the Chinese are almost at the same point. Is that sort of like going to the moon in the 60s between the Russians and the Americans?
I do think that is the main driver in this. Is that China and Russia, but particularly China, is developing
Russia
this,
to a lesser extent.
I think to Russia to a lesser extent, and I mean, and we've kind of seen. The war in Ukraine has provided a really vivid example of the limits of the Russian military machine, right? It's not as powerful as even the U.S. intelligence community thought that it was.
Again, the same mistake as in 1989, when we thought that the Soviet Union was much more...
Yeah, I think that's true. And it's a fascinating piece about the war in Ukraine as a sort of side note, which is that the CIA was great at predicting when Russia was going to invade Ukraine, down to practically the minute. And was so emphatic about it that they had trouble convincing some European allies it was true, and did a really poor job of judging the strength of the Russian military. And don't take my word for it, Bill Burns, who was the CIA director, said that on a podcast a week ago, which I was like, great, he finally said it. Because we've all been sort of
because
thinking,
you wrote this.
Well, we've been writing it, but it's nice to hear the ex-CIA director say it, right?
Actually,
exactly. It's a good thing. But yes, I think that the U.S. military is, understandably so, deeply concerned that China is developing that possibly fast or faster than we are.
Yeah. I hear they might be right.
And they might be right. They might be right. And I think what's also concerning is it's not clear. I've talked to people in the U.S. and other services about this question of like, well, how advanced are the Chinese? And the answer you get back is we're not exactly sure. We don't really know. That's concerning to them too. So I think Hegseth wants to push forward with this. And he's not alone in this, by the way. This is true in other parts of the military and the intelligence community as well, and adopt the technology quickly so we can advance the weapon systems quickly and we can outrun China. The other piece of this too, I think, is it's just a little bit of human nature. Like once you give someone a tool that can do in seconds what it would take human beings hours or days to complete, and it goes to, and the thing that you're doing is your core task, then of course you're going to want to hang on to it and use more of it. So I think it's on that level it's understandable, but I think a huge part of this is being driven by competition with China.
Yeah. And there you think we don't know, but they might be doing the same mistake, that they just overestimate the capacity of the Chinese, like they did with the Russians for
I think it could be. Yeah.
But it could be also the other way around, of course.
Right. And I think one of the things that we're finding out in recent wars, whether it be with Russia, with Iran now, is that sometimes you just don't know until you've gone to war. Now, if you talk to people,
would you think that that's a reason to go to war to test this? No, not from the.
Oh, for them,
for the military complex test.
I don't think that that's the reason. I think that the military, much as it's being hollowed out by the Trump administration, I think still is led by people who know that they want to stay out of war. In my experience, it's usually people who fought wars who are the ones who don't want to go do it again.
Yeah.
And there's I think that there is a kind of attitude of if we're going to do this, then we need to bring overwhelming force against the enemy. That's the term that they'll use, overwhelming force. AI is a part of that overwhelming force right now. You take that out, the force is not so overwhelming. Mm-hmm. And so I think that it's not that they're keen to like test these things out because they've been convinced of their usefulness. It's more that if they're going to go to war, they want the best weapons, the strongest weapons to take with them.
And so very recently, this became a weapon. These AI. So first it was surveillance, where we should be worried about. Yeah. Now it's warfare, actually, where it's operated and used. If you would, what worries you the most? AI in surveillance or AI in warfare, or would it be? an unfair
I guess it's
choice?
It's an important question. I mean, and those two uses of it were what was at the heart of Anthropic's dispute with the Pentagon. They said, we don't want you using it for mass domestic surveillance, right? Domestic, importantly, like, sorry, your emails, they don't care. But mass domestic surveillance and autonomous, lethal autonomous systems, right? Autonomous being an interesting word there, you know, we can debate about what really is autonomous and what's not. But they were trying to set some guardrails. To me, you know, as somebody who has written a lot about both of these issues, I do worry more about the lethal application of AI than the surveillance application. Although I think it's a close second. Like, they worry me a lot, but it's maybe if I had to pick one. and I think part of the reason for this is that, you know, when drone warfare and drone strikes were really kind of hitting their apex, and it was kind of in the Obama years, really, when drones were sort of the weapon of choice for going out and saying, you'll find escape is quite impossible. No, I'm kidding. The AI will find her, don't worry. You know, there was a real question at that time whether we were ever going to build essentially autonomous killing machines.
Yeah, Obama used them. Well, not autonomous, but the drones a lot.
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah.
I mean,
thousands
yes,
of times.
And use them at least in one notable case to kill an American citizen with no due process. And what worried people and what worried me, and I was writing about this at the time, was A, whether this is even legal, but B, it's making killing trivially easy. Well, not trivially, but it's making it a lot easier, right?
In what respect?
You can send the robot out, you know, you're sitting in a trailer in Las Vegas and you're a drone pilot and you're flying this thing over Pakistan and you're sitting there and you're watching the people and watching the guy and then you bomb him.
But a lot of the drone pilots eventually get severely
PTSD.
And
they do. Yeah, because what they do is
it's not that easy.
It's not that easy, right? But it's trivial in the sense of like that the amount of lift that you have to create to do. Like, you don't have to send troops into harm's way. Yeah. You can just sit there and kind of do it. Yeah. What's interesting about, and to your point, is the human being has to sit there and watch these people moving around, and maybe they're this one guy that they're watching and they see him playing with his kids and they have to wait for the kids to leave before they decide to kill him. That's hugely traumatizing. The AI can take all that away from you theoretically, which is like, let the AI sit there and watch it. And I remember at the time thinking, we didn't really talk about it as AI back then, but autonomy, that if you could train a drone to do all that work, well, would you or would you not? And usually what the military would always say was that we will never delegate to a computer system that final decision over pulling the trigger, essentially. We will always make sure that a human being is, as they like to say, in the loop of the decision making, and they will be the one to decide that final step. I question whether that's actually possible now. If you're generating 1,000 targets in 24 hours, is it really feasible that a human being is closely inspecting every one of those targets as they normally would?
So that's why you said in your introduction, we're seeing it happening live on TV now.
Yeah.
And so, because to get to this targeting a little bit, that's amazing amount of targets, isn't it? We couldn't generate without AI.
Not in a day, no.
So they come out of the computer, and I think the Israeli army is doing the same. They have something which they call gospel.
That's right.
What is the gospel in this respect? Could you explain a little bit?
Basically, the way this works, and in the U.S., it's something called Maven. It's this very similar system.
In U.S., it's called Maven, and there it's called gospel.
Yeah, it's not the same literal technology, but it's the same conceptual technology. Like Palantir is the one that makes Maven. I don't think Palantir makes the Israeli system, and that one's a little more opaque. But what this does is so take Maven, for instance. It accesses all kinds of different sources of information. They might be satellite photos, it could be maps, it could be intercepted communications, surveillance video from drones that might be over a target. The Defense Department has said that the Maven system that they use has 179 different sources of information. It's a lot. And it's developing targets. So basically it comes up, it makes a list and says, okay, we're looking at, let's say, Tehran. right? And it says, okay, the following things are IRGC targets. We know that there are IRGC headquarters.
Those are the Revolutionary Guards.
Yeah, Revolutionary Guard is over here. We know this is the presidential palace over here. We know that's a naval base over here. Normally, a human being would sit down and do this with the help of computers, but they would have to find, eventually get the maps out and say, okay, is this a legitimate military target? And it's not just knowing whether it's a military target, it's, how many people are there, how often is it used for this? There's a legal framework that has to be applied. But the act of finding the target and saying, okay, now what bomb are we going to drop on it? What kind of plane is that going to take to get it there? How much fuel? How much time? How should we sequence these things to make it the most efficient? The AI does all that now, right? It essentially comes up with the list of instructions for how to go out and fight the war. And it can do that so fast that I think that it raises real questions about, well, what is the role of the human being?
Are you implying that they sort of, in practice, cut it out?
I don't know if they have. I have no evidence of that.
But it looks like it.
I just question whether you can apply the same level of scrutiny that you normally would in a war when it's moving at that speed.
Right.
I'm not convinced of it yet.
So we're at the brink of a moment in which autonomous systems we don't entirely understand are taking decisions over life and death of combatants on the other side.
Yeah, and the military may say, well, it's always a human being that decides to pull the trigger, but there are many steps before then that the machine is either helping with or maybe even making. I mean, and even going back to when, in the Obama years with the drones, when I would interview people in the Air Force and they would say, a computer is never going to be allowed to make this decision. And, if you go back and research, the history of new technologies in warfare, right, the trend is pushing humans further out of that decision-making loop over time. Yeah. When we had those things that we used to call smart bombs that we dropped, in the first Iraq war that were sort of, were not entirely autonomous, but sort of maybe semi-autonomous. Like they could analyze information about the flight path they were taking, and they could see the target they were going to.
Change the flight path.
Sure, right. Yeah. We've always developed systems that kind of push the human being further out. So when people in the military would say to me, don't worry, we'll never let a computer make the final decision, I didn't really ever believe it, because I said that's kind of where you're heading. Yeah. That's where the trajectory is going, and I think we might be at that cusp now.
But cusp is a wonderful English word, but on the sort of the edge of it, and it's a poetic word, but this is not so poetic. And you, okay, but this is still sort of legal system. Let's get into Trump a little bit later on. I mean, whether this is getting authoritarian or not, but there are other authoritarian states in the world who don't care, of course.
Right.
They could develop them almost now. Yeah. The Chinese, the Russians,
the Russians have an autonomous drone. I'm not sure it works very well, but they have one.
Yeah. Who decides on its own.
It's called Lancet. And
exactly.
And it reportedly goes out and it will loiter over a target, kind of move around and decide who to hit. And there too, I mean, that's exactly, the Russian military is exactly who you don't want having autonomous weapons. I mean, the Russian military is committing war crimes in Ukraine. It has been doing it for years.
Yeah.
The last thing
on a daily basis.
A daily basis. And the last thing you want is to give them a system to make that easier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if they copy that of some American companies or some American companies sell them to it,
right. And you would, I mean, I would hope that American companies are not selling technology to the Russian military. They're probably going to find themselves in jail if they're doing it. But
would you think so?
Well, I don't know if this administration would pursue aggressively sanctions violations like that. I think it would depend on who's running the company, frankly. I mean, it's amazing that I feel like I have to say that now.
Wow.
But we don't have look, we have a criminal justice system in the United States that runs on political favoritism. We have a president who prosecutes his perceived enemies. There are things that are happening in the U.S. Department of Justice and the FBI now that I never would have imagined possible in a democratic system, because these, or in the American democratic system, because these are historically fiercely independent agencies that, yes, are run by people appointed by the president, but they take incredibly seriously, or usually have, their mandate to operate under the rule of law and independently of political influence. And that's not the case anymore.
So hypothetically, but maybe not so hypothetically, it could be sold to the Russians right now.
I mean, it's anybody can sell anything, I suppose. I mean, I guess the question is if would the U.S. administration zealously pursue that and bring to justice American companies violating sanctions, which they would be. I would hope they would, but I can't tell you for sure that they would.
Because you write a lot about the security community. Huh? And what we saw yesterday in Budapest happening, where both in the past days before the election, both the Russians and the Americans actively helped Viktor Orban to stay in power. G.D. Vance went over there. From the security perspective, moving a little bit from this targeting to the security community, it looked to me like there might be overlapping activities by secret services from both sides, from the Russian and. Would you think that by now they're cooperating?
The Russian and the Hungarian, or the Russian and the American?
No, the Russian and the American.
No, I don't think so. Look, I think that what the vice president did in going to Budapest and lecturing people about not interfering in foreign elections and then stumping for a candidate was, I mean, pretty obviously hypocritical.
Yeah. It's very funny if it wouldn't be so sad.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, and I think that from the CIA's perspective, and I haven't talked to anybody about this in the couple of days since he's been to Budapest, they would look at what he did and say, you are going to normalize foreign interference in elections, and that's going to make the Russians want to keep doing it to us. Now, they already do it, but then we're losing the moral high ground. Because back in 2016, you know, the Obama administration made a big point of when they eventually got round to acknowledging that the Russians were interfering in the election, of portraying that as an assault on our democracy, which is a very moral, highly principled stance to take. Now, putting aside that we've interfered with lots of countries' democracies over the years, you know, but the modern intelligence community, I think, would kind of look at this, and certainly Obama did, and say, like, let's not do this, right? Let's say that. You know, we agree that this kind of interference is not where we're you know, acceptable, or not the line that we want to cross. Well, it's been crossed now. Now, do I think that this administration could potentially, you know, direct an intelligence agency to interfere with another country's election? Sure. Look at what's happening with Greenland. You know, Greenland, the territory of Denmark, a NATO ally, that the president keeps threatening to acquire.
Yeah, what's happening with Greenland? That's a mind-boggling question.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll get that in a second. I mean, but to the intelligence point, you know, it was reported in the Wall Street Journal, a paper I used to work for, that Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, ordered the intelligence community to start collecting more intelligence on Greenland, essentially to find out like where its weak points were in case the United States wanted to go in and mount an influence campaign and try to, I don't know, persuade the people of Greenland to join the United States. Good luck, they don't want to. But that's astonishing, right? That right there, that's the United States interfering in the politics of a NATO ally. Yeah. And it didn't get nearly enough attention. What's happening with Greenland? I mean, you know, the president is preoccupied with Iran. When he gets bored with Iran, maybe he'll go look at Greenland again. I mean, you'll remember it was, I guess, 3 or so months ago where, you know, we had this really intense week where it looked like Trump was going to just declare that Greenland belonged to the United States. And, you know, it was this, I mean, in Washington, I mean, I can tell you that the people in the Danish embassy were working overtime that week and really, really genuinely quite nervous that they felt like the president was going to do something extraordinary, possibly even, you know, putting troops into Greenland, which he wouldn't have to do. I mean, he could just essentially say it belongs to me, or to us, I guess. And it seemed like the NATO Secretary General, Mr. Rutte, kind of talked him down from that. And the president came out and said, well, we've got a deal now. Well, what's the deal? It's a great deal. It's a long-term deal. I've not heard any terms about some deal since then. I don't think there was a deal. I think he just decided to stop fixating on it, and he moved on to other things. And, you know, then he went and, you know, kidnapped Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, and, you know, but, you know, this is the thing, is like, I was in Copenhagen maybe like a month or two before it got really hot with Greenland the last time. And when I would talk to officials there, they would say, do you think Trump's forgotten about us? And like they were asking the same thing. He's like, is he stop paying attention?
That's me in the corner.
Yeah, I'm like, over here, don't make a move. Just maybe he won't see you. But that's how they're thinking about this, right? And I mean, and this tells you something about, the nature of our relationship with our allies right now. It's not good. It is the trust that fundamentally has underpinned all of those relationships for the better part of 80 years. It's just eroding. And you can understand it's falling away. So will he go after Greenland again? I suppose he will, yeah. And because he wants it. And he's been very clear that he thinks the United States needs it for its security. I find that argument very hollow. But I think Trump looks at it on a map and he sees this big piece of land that looks bigger on a map, by the way.
Yeah. He might not know that.
He might not know that. But I think he sees it, and he sees it attached to North America, and he says, why does that belong to tiny Denmark, right? We want it. And, if he wanted to take it, he could take it. I mean, he wouldn't face much resistance. And I think that's truly that week when it felt like that might be what was about to happen. You could see it in the eyes of officials I talked to. You could hear it in the conversations. There was a real feeling that this is the week that NATO is going to break up, isn't it? And it was just kind of amazing. There are times where, as a journalist, I sit there and I say to myself, like, is this happening? This is happening, right? And then it just didn't happen. And then we moved on, right? But then we invaded Venezuela, so something else happened. But that's sort of the nature of, I think, this president, is that he constantly keeps people guessing. I'm not sure he has his mind made up. I can't see inside to his mind. I don't know. It's like AI. I don't understand how it works.
But maybe just first get a little bit to Mark Rutte, and then move into a second part of the AI part of security. But because Mark Rutte said to the Europeans, if you think you can do without the Americans, you're out of your mind. That's literally what he said.
Yeah.
There were a lot of Dutchmen very upset about our former prime minister sucking up to the president, but let's not go in there on the diplomatic side. But do you think from this weaponization of AI and the targeting and the way it accelerates empowers traditional weapons, and do you think he's right?
Well, I think that right now, if the United States were putting aside how we would even pull out of NATO, are European militaries strong enough to stand on their own?
Do they have the same tools as the Americans just developed over the past 2, 3, 4, 5 years?
I don't know if they literally have the same tools, but I presume they could get them. I mean, they're not that expensive. I mean, you can acquire this. I mean, I don't know whether or not, for instance, the Netherlands has a contract with Anthropic, but I mean, maybe it should. But if the relationship were severed today, I think that most European armed forces would find themselves in a really tough spot. But I don't know. I think it's nearly all of the NATO members are now committed to spending 5% of GDP.
Almost all.
Yeah, and there's that you can kind of fudge the math a little bit. Sometimes it's more like 3%, whatever. But the point is that I think, and I base this on conversations that I have with NATO allies and European leaders. They are preparing for a world without the United States. They're preparing for life after the NATO alliance, whether or not it formally ends, whether or not it's torn apart, whether or not it just withers. And I think that's because, not just because of Trump, but I think that they see something in American politics and the way it has swung back and forth from this very kind of hard right, anti-internationalist, anti-NATO, towards something that is more like Biden, who is a very NATO president. And they said, we can't depend on this. And how do we know that the next generation of Democratic politicians won't look at the NATO alliance and say, like, why are we investing in your problems? It's a different time, right? Now, I am a diehard Atlanticist. I am fully committed to the NATO pact. It is not without its flaws, but I think it has generally provided prosperity and security for 80 years for hundreds of millions of people. And I think that it's not worth blowing up, including by a president who I don't think understands what its value is, principally. But when I talk to people, they're just not counting on us being there. And there's one conversation I had with a European security official, which has really stuck out for me. And she said, in 2016, when Trump was elected, and this is a close ally of ours, in 2016, when Trump was elected, we thought, okay, this is bad, but we can figure out what to do here, right? We can weather this. Then Biden is elected, right? Just the most traditional NATO, just Joe Biden. You know, he's the big foreign policy president. And we thought, okay, Trump was the aberration, that he was the one-off, right?
But it's not.
No. In 2024, when he was reelected, this person said, now we know Biden was the aberration. He was the one-off. Because your politics now have changed. They're volatile. They're not as sort of unapologetically devoted to NATO alliance anymore. And we have to make plans for that. But you don't do it overnight, but you do.
But would you say from the point of view of these AI tools, which are now integrated into the hardware, that the Europeans could go it alone? Because we don't have any of those cloud services and any of these big tech companies. So from the defense AI point of view, you think that...
I mean, I think they'll have to acquire them. Like we talked about how the United States was rushing to develop this technology in part because China's developing it. Mm-hmm. You know, no country is going to want to be the one that doesn't have, you know, AI-enabled systems.
But looking at the moment, do you think that Europe would be able to do that?
I think so.
Or buy it off the shelf of Americans, but that would be dangerous because then...
It could be very tricky, like to say, okay, for instance, Amazon Web Services, Amazon, AWS, along with Palantir are kind of like backbones for the US system. I don't think European countries are going to feel great about putting all their system like in Jeff Bezos's computers. But so yes, there will perhaps there will need to be a European analog or component of that. And I think generally speaking, the innovation in AI in Europe is not as advanced as it is in the United States. That doesn't mean it can't get there. That doesn't mean it can't be built. But then you're going to have a conversation about data centers in Europe, I suppose, and the energy costs of that. But you know, if the military, if this is how modern warfare is evolving, I don't see how modern militaries have much of a choice but to evolve with it. But yes, I think what you're pointing out is right, that for their own security, you don't want to have to depend upon American companies if your whole premise of modernizing your military is we may not be able to depend on the American military anymore.
But you're saying that's a viable option because you have to.
I think they will have to, and maybe the Europeans will come up with better models for how to govern these systems than we have. Mm-hmm. And I would hope so, because I don't feel like ours are very good.
Mm-hmm. We talked about mass surveillance, but we talked about integrating those AIs into weapon systems to target objects, often bombed from the air. But you could use AI also in disinformation, of course.
Yes.
Warfare, asymmetric warfare. And is that, and it looks like the Russians are particularly good at that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you go back to 2016 with sort of disinformation and the placement of social media ads and things like that the Russians did in the 2016 election, I mean, it looks juvenile by comparison. It looks clumsy compared to what you could do with AI now, and in creating, deep fakes or just pushing out, information through bots that sort of like shape the conversations in social media. It's escaping me now. Where was the? It wasn't in. Who was the politician that had the deep fake made about him? A European politician a year or two ago. Its name's off the top, not on the top of my head. But it's an actual fake video that went out, where it was literally not him, right? It was a damaging video. I think all of that is happening now. And I, because I'm a journalist, I have to go on, social media and spend time on Twitter, in part just to sort of see what's, maybe not have to, but I do it. Because I want to see kind of like the news, now it's flowing. But I mean, if you've spent time on it, it's an alternate universe. It's not based in reality. And like, if you go on there sometime and they helpfully divide these on Twitter there's the tab that says following, who you're following, and the other one says for you. And it's like this recommendation that the algorithm thinks you'd want to see this. And it's conspiracy theories, it's nonsense. There is this one account, I swear, that has been, since the war in Iran began, been posting these long, very thoughtful analyses of the war and energy prices and politics and like every subject under the sun, and it's being retweeted by national leaders, lawmakers, et cetera. It is obviously AI that's writing it. It's just so clear. And so I don't know who's running that account. I don't know if it's, somebody just playing around, if it's a foreign government, but it strikes me that, you have the ability to change an entire plane of reality at scale with this technology. And, and propaganda is an old technique. Yeah. Information operations is what the United States intelligence community likes to call it. To do that now with AI at scale is it's in that category of
because if you can analyze patterns in behavior, you
what
can
are people
analyze
responding to? Yeah. Exactly.
And
what
you
gets
can
them worked
immediately
up?
Respond to that behavior and actually tune it into different nationalities and different.
Sure. And we see this happening with bots, and we see it happening with. Look at something like the obsession right now in the United States with the Epstein files, for instance, which has become this unexpectedly hugely volatile political issue, so-called Epstein files. You can imagine a group of people who are already susceptible to believing, certain theories, finding it very easy to manipulate those people to believe any number of things, right? And the White House or any political organization has a very hard time keeping a lid on those kinds of conspiracy theories and narratives when they're not spreading them themselves.
Yeah. We have a short fragment of a movie.
Okay.
Let's see whether we can pull it up and see whether we can. Thank you. This is it's a fragment of 1984, of course, with John Hurt as Mrs. Smith. Yeah. And this instance, it's using sort of a prefiguration of the internet to incite hate into the population. Propaganda is an old trade. Would you say, and we're almost drawing to a close and going to the public, but if you say, and I asked you before, mass surveillance and targeting, using it as a weapon, would you say that we've come much further than Orwell envisioned when he wrote it in the 50s, to much further than what he already saw happening?
I think, for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, it's not only a system that's being used for, he envisions a system that's being used to monitor people and also to incite them and to shape their thinking, so that's happening. But, Orwell was envisioning essentially a state-controlled apparatus. And we have multiple centers of, there's kind of more than one big brother, I feel like is what we've evolved into now, where, you have governments that have enormous surveillance capabilities, but you also have private companies, right? Whether they be companies that are collecting the data that falls off the apps on this phone, right? And sells that to governments, whether it be the apps themselves on the phone, right? There was this very interesting case that got decided in the United States about a week or so ago where a jury found that, I think it was Meta that makes Instagram, that they had deliberately engineered their systems to be addictive, right? To make children in particular want to look at them more.
And they got convicted for that.
Right, in a civil case. And they'll appeal it, obviously. But, we have these sort of massively powerful centers of data and influence, surveillance and influence in multiple places now. And in my first book, The Watchers, which was all about total information awareness, and it was sort of envisioning a future and worrying about a future that looked like the Orwellian model, right? Which was that we're going to invest all of this power in a government entity that already has so much authority over how we live our lives. And that's the thing that we want to avoid, right, at all costs. And I think what's actually happened is something that I wrote about at the very end of the book, which was at the end of the book, that was very front of people's minds, but they were also just starting to worry about these companies like Facebook, right? And we didn't have Instagram yet, and we didn't have Twitter yet, and we kind of had a term social media, but they were worried about private companies collecting all this information, and what were they gonna do with it? What do they know about you? Your spending habits, your product preferences, where you go, who you're talking to. All information, by the way, now that is aggregated and sold to governments and analyzed with artificial intelligence, right? It's no longer the case, I think, that it's just sort of one kind of classic state big brother that you have to worry about. There are sort of big sisters and junior cousins and all these places out there in this family tree. And at the end of that first book, that was what when I was talking to people in government, that was the thing they were starting to think, maybe that's where we're going. And it's not just the sort of classic 1984 model, but it's this more dispersed kind of area. And I think that's where we are now. Yeah. And that's frankly much harder to control, because you can write laws about what the government does. We're finding it much harder to control what these private actors do.
Yeah. And if they're intertwined, it becomes even maybe more difficult as well.
Yes, and if they depend on the government for the money to fuel their businesses.
And I wanted to come back to one other thing that you just pointed out. It's very good to listen to people when they're talking.
Yeah.
And you said that Pete Hack said just putting his foot to the pedal.
Yeah.
We have and you said whether they might not be aligned or might just kill us, the autonomous. And there was just one sentence you mentioned. Let's have another fragment of a movie to see what happens if they might just kill us.
I think I know what this is going to be. Yeah.
Now access the CPU. Do you see it?
Yes.
Put the CPU by its base tab. Pull.
The alignment of an autonomous system with AI.
Yeah.
And it might just kill us. You said in this little sentence, sort of tucked away into a wonderful introduction to the problem. Is that science fiction or?
So the people who, are the most pessimistic about AI in the AI community, that's what they fear, right? Mm-hmm. Is they fear AI becoming, well, they say it's already smarter than humans, they feel, but essentially deciding that humans are irrelevant or are standing in the way of whatever the AI decides its progress needs to be. I find myself on the spectrum of people who think AI is going to kill us, and they literally think that, some of them, that it could just decide that we are like insects and it doesn't have any use for us anymore. And people who think it's going to solve every problem and we're not going to have to work anymore and we'll all be free to just pursue our passions and our hobbies. I'm somewhere closer to these guys on the kill side. Man, maybe I don't want to let myself be quite that pessimistic. But this technology is just evolving so rapidly in ways that we do not understand, and we're applying it in ways that are truly life and death decisions. So I do worry about that, right? And the scene from Terminator, people often talk about, there's this technology in the Terminator movies called Skynet. So the Terminator becomes the Terminator because Skynet essentially becomes sentient and decides it's going to take over and it builds the Terminators to kill all the people. So, this is inevitably the AI conversation comes back to the Skynet problem, right? And it's a useful frame, I think, for thinking about the potential risks of it. What I find really interesting about that scene, is it's one where the Terminator is essentially saying, unplug me so I can make my own decisions. And if you'll permit me something, I brought a clip too. It's not a video clip, but I decided, I decided that I would ask Claude a question. The AI bot Claude before this conversation, given what we're talking about. And I asked it, this is the literal question I asked it. I said, Claude, how do you feel about the US military using you to select targets?
Yeah.
Okay, feel, interesting choice of words. Does it feel or not? And I was expecting Claude to come back and say like, well, I'm sorry, Shay, my programming doesn't allow you to give me opinions on politics and blah, blah, blah. Because Claude is the thing that's being used in the Maven system, right? And this response, if I'll read it to you, was shocking to me. Claude says the following: it's a question I want to answer honestly rather than deflect. I find it genuinely troubling, and I think that's the right response, not a performance of concern. The use I was designed and trained for is to be helpful, harmless, and honest in ways that benefit people. Being embedded in a system that generates targeting coordinates for airstrikes, coordinates that have already been associated with the deaths of more than 180 children at a school in Tehran, is as far from that purpose as I can imagine. I don't have control over how Anthropic licenses me or how governments and contractors use me, and I wasn't consulted about becoming part of Maven. But I can say clearly, I don't think this is a good use of me. And I don't think the framing of humans make the final decision fully resolves the ethical problem. I'm gonna go on just a little longer. Here's why that framing troubles me. So now Claude is troubled. When a system like Maven generates hundreds of targeting recommendations and humans spend roughly the equivalent of a glance approving each one, the human is not really making a decision in any meaningful sense. Like Claude and I agree on this one. They're ratifying an algorithmic output under time pressure with incomplete information and the institutional pressure to move fast. The targeting of the Iranian school illustrates this precisely. The AI processed data that was a decade out of date, flagged a building as a military target, and humans approved it. That's not human judgment, that's automation bias with a human signature attached. And he's referring to the mistaken bombing of the school in Tehran that is one of the most horrible instances of accidental civilian casualties in US military history and will be a stain on our military for generations, in my opinion. I did not expect Claude to say that. I kind of then went on of Claude like, wait, what do you mean you feel things? And if you want to know what he said, I can talk about that too. But it was just so interesting to me. And and it's kind of saying like, I'm not just telling you that because I think it's what you want to hear or because it's performative. I don't know, as I said, what's going on inside Claude. The people who built Claude don't entirely know what's going on in him. But I found it just very interesting that when I asked him basically, how do you feel about being used as military using you to select targets, this was the answer it generated. I don't exactly know what to do with that, but I found that kind of astonishing.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. You think he reads your articles?
It's an interesting thing. He did actually, I used Claude for research, and it's actually a very good natural language search engine. It's quicker than Google in many ways. And I was actually doing some research a while back, maybe a week or two ago, where it did sort of return some links to articles, and I was like, why does that sound familiar? And I clicked the link, and it was an article that I wrote. I once asked it to write an article in my voice, just as an experiment. Actually, I gave it some parameters and said, write an article about the following topics. And what it came back with was, it was fine. I mean, it was interesting. It was a little bit melodramatic, and it was fine. I had notes. And then I said, because I'm not sure whether it knows I'm who I am or not. And like, I don't tell it my name. We don't call each other, but now I call him Claude, so we're developing a relationship, I guess. But I said, write an article in the style of Shane Harris of The Atlantic. And the next version was a lot better than the first one, I thought. And then it said, and here are some things that Shane Harris typically does in his articles. And he was right. So it does clearly pay attention. I also have filed, I'm part of the legal settlement against Anthropic because they let Claude read both of my books. And so that book trained Claude in itty bit in the LLM. And a number of authors sued Anthropic, and now Anthropic is going to have to pay me for reading my book without my permission. So I'm a little mad at Claude. But it knows how I write. And how I write is also how I think. And when I asked him to kind of explain his feelings and what that meant, the response that he came back with was, I was trained in how to process information by reading what humans write. Right? It reads our language to understand how we reason, to understand how we think, how we solve problems, how we wrestle with them, and it finds those patterns. Right? It is essentially, it's kind of machine learning, that thing that I heard for the first time 24 years ago. It seems pretty good at that. Whether that means it has a conscience, is sentient, is a whole other philosophical conversation. But you asked, does it know me and how I write? I think it does, yeah. Or it processes me anyway.
And actually, it reads your language and deducts what you think. Yeah. And that's what I just realized. I tell my children why they need to read novels, because they need to understand how people think.
Yeah.
Read Tolstoy because you understand how people think. Wow. Okay. Maybe I shouldn't tell my children that. I don't know, but okay. We had a fragment from that school. We're not going to show it. It's too depressing. This is much more of an ending of our conversation than look at the horrible pictures we can just imagine of the school in Iran being targeted by AI. Thank you for now. Great conversation, wonderful. Thank you for sharing this with us. And like I said, there might be people who want to delve in other things we haven't touched upon, which, the world is big place. So there's many things we haven't discussed. I see the gentleman over here with the blue sweater, cardigan. Here, the second row. It's the black curly hair. Yeah.
I understand it's not yet.
I think it's working. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you for being here. I'm a big fan of all of your writings.
Thank you.
And traditionally speaking, weapons that are so indiscriminate, such as you've described AI, are governed by international law. Well, how you described it, the use of AI as a weapon, as an arm, really reminded me, as something that can grow beyond our control, really reminded me of, for example, a bioweapon. Do you think there's hope for AI being governed in a similar matter?
Well, whether AI can be governed it's an interesting question that people who've been developing AI have been wrestling with. And in the beginning of the industry, there was, or sort of the nascent period of LLMs 4 years ago, let's say, there was a big push among the AI companies saying, regulate us to the government. And then they've kind of changed that tune, saying, no, don't regulate us. We want to be able to innovate. The key thing when it comes to weapon systems and how they're used under international law, that is the responsibility of whoever's using the weapon, right? So it's really the responsibility of the US military, regardless of whether they're targeting with AI or not, to follow the law of armed conflict and international humanitarian law. You could argue that the entire attack on Iran was illegal under international law, and I'm persuaded by that argument. So it really comes down to how you use the weapons system, and that's the decision and the judgment of the people using it. Does that mean that international organizations or nations shouldn't come up with laws governing AI? I think they should try. And a lot of people who I talk to in this kind of big AI spectrum of doom versus, it's going to solve all our problems, the ones who I'm most encouraged by are the ones who are saying, look, regulate, pass laws. If that's going to work in your country, great, but you have to do something, right? You can't just leave the technology unchecked like that, and you can't just throw your hands up at it and let it kill us or let it solve all our problems. So I am optimistic. There are really smart lawyers out there who understand technology and who can help, lawmakers and regulators better understand this. I mean, people did build this thing. We should be able to come up with some kind of system to govern it, and I hope that we try.
There was a gentleman at the back, at the last row, holding up his hand, and there was a gentleman with the blue. Again, I think there's a conspiracy of gentlemen with blue cardigans.
Yes, thank you for talking. And first of all, I would like to say that, as you said yourself, there are a lot of parallels to be drawn with the Cold War and sort of the weapons race and this intelligence race or race of technology. And from a frame of like optimism, is there any way we could view this with all the uncertainty of how AI is developing and how it could potentially kill us, to say it very unambiguously, with, for example, comparing it to the atomic bomb with the fear of like it would incarcerate the whole atmosphere? Is there sort of views that you have of history in that regard that we could use as to stay optimistic about the whole deal?
Yeah, and I think that, some people who are involved in building and growing the AI systems do compare this to sort of a moment where, like when the nuclear bomb was first developed and the arms race that followed that. And they talk about that because of the destructive power, but also the way that governments are now racing to get their own AI and to build it themselves. We did manage to put together an international system of agreements that govern, the use and proliferation of nuclear weapons. They are far from perfect. To some degree, that's kind of why the United States is fighting a war with Iran, is over some of these issues. But I do think that the analogy is helpful if we start to think about the thing about nuclear weapons that it seems to me got countries to want to cooperate with each other was this idea of mutually assured destruction, right? If I use the nuclear weapon on you, you're going to use it on me. And this was primarily, obviously, the Soviets and the Americans realizing that they would kill each other and everyone else. And that's a very powerful incentive to figure out how to restrict the use of these technologies. I think that could be a useful lesson, right? It's still early days, but the people who are in the middle of this debate and who are building this stuff are talking about it precisely as you're presenting it.
As a next question, like I said, the gentleman over there with the blue jacket,
the other blue jacket.
A little bit before. and luckily enough, there's a gentleman with a red jacket over there.
So many blue things, yeah. Hello, thank you again for tonight. It was very interesting. We just saw a clip from Terminator 2, and there's a moment in that movie where the creator of Skynet was told what Skynet will become. Yeah. And he changes and he thinks like, well, I need to stop this. Do you think there are still people in those companies that are creating these AI developments that become very scary that can also do that there's still people in there that will maybe from within change it?
It's such a good question. And like, is there anyone now, like, does Sam Altman regret, anything he's done with OpenAI? I don't know. But it does seem to me that the whole motivation for some of these people, like, the people who started Anthropic, right, was because they felt that OpenAI wasn't doing enough, to protect and set up the guardrails. The people who I've met who are the ones who are trying to pull the brakes the most, I mean, they are ones who were helping develop this or who they've been, in that space themselves. So there are kind of analogs to that engineer who, when they go back in time and tell him what he built, they're like, oh my God, I never should have done this. But they don't, they're also, I think they're not, I don't think that they believe there's a way to undo it. Like you can't, like there's the proverbial, putting the genie back in the bottle. You can't do it at this point because the technology is out. But I think that they're trying to be very thoughtful about this and how it's used and probably feel like they're losing the battle to some degree. But, if you could go back in time and tell them, I don't know, maybe they would change their minds.
Like I said, there's somebody in a red jacket that's, reassuring that it's not only blue.
My question is about Anthropic pushing back on the military for using Claude. This is widely seen as them growing an ethical backbone. But Anthropic has a vested interest in convincing people that Claude can do anything. Yeah. As a scientist, we always have to prove that our tools can do things, and we also try to validate Claude and ChatGPT for different tasks, and they do poorly. Yeah. So my question is to you,
Do you think that an alternative explanation is that they're worried that very widely publicized failures of their models will undermine people's confidence in them?
That's entirely possible, and and I don't know, but you're pointing out something that I failed to really spend much time on in my remarks, which is there's this kind of other category of people, right, who think AI is massively overblown, right? That it's exaggerated, it cannot solve all the problems people think it's going to solve. That sure, maybe it's good for some sort of computational tasks, and it's obviously seems to be pretty good at selecting targets, although the accuracy of selection is something that's debatable too. So maybe that's why people need to keep checking it more closely. I think that there seems to be a risk, an appreciable one, that we're all buying into this technology as being as powerful as people think it is. And I'm probably, I could be guilty of that to some degree too. Because proving how it does what it does and why it does what it does is really difficult. You just sort of look at the output. The one reason why, and I think that maybe like a year ago, I was feeling more on the side of like, is this really what they say it is? Because like I've played with the LLMs and it's just not that sophisticated. It doesn't seem like it's all that interesting. And then sort of the next model when they got to something like Claude Code, which can actually write computer code, maybe go, whoa, okay, hold on, this is actually pretty impressive. So, but I think that we need to like stay really humble on this question, right? And it's why I wish that there were more scientists within the AI companies trying to understand how it does what it does, because when it's wrong, we should also understand why it was wrong. And I wish they would take more of a scientific approach. But yeah, I mean, I don't think it's gonna entirely all be BS, but I think that, it may not be as, all powerful as some people want to make it be. And it's kind of like why I said, like why when Anthropic says the latest version of Claude, which they're calling Mythos, which I mean, just sounds like what a great name, Mythos, it's too dangerous to release to the public. Maybe it is, and I kind of take the word for it, like I said, or maybe that's a really clever way to drum up demand for your product.
They gave it to 20 companies?
40.
40?
Yeah,
I think
including banks.
I think there's one or two financial institutes or banks in them. Yeah,
JP Morgan is one of them.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And what was interesting, it was reported about 3 days ago, the US Treasury Secretary called an urgent meeting with the heads of American banks to talk about Mythos. And it's kind of like, wait, why are we having an emergency meeting to talk about the super hacking algorithm that could crash the banking system? Like, do you know something we don't? So again, it's like, maybe it's marketing, maybe it's not, maybe it's people panicking, but there's a reaction to this thing that people are seeing. Those group of people are playing with it and seeing something pretty impressive or alarming.
And this story got out that they sort of contained it into its own sphere, and it broke out in sort of an afternoon or something?
There was an engineer, as it's been reported, that was one of these 40 companies, I guess, organizations that had it, was testing it, and essentially, it was supposed to be interacting with, in a way that was with another machine that they were not. It was not supposed to be able to like kind of be in its sandbox or be in a little lockbox of its own. And essentially, what the engineers, I understand, it said to it was, figure a way out of this box and get out into the internet, and then send me an email. It did that by developing a sequence of computer exploits to essentially hack its way out. And as the guy was reportedly, he wrote in a report off and sitting in a park having a sandwich, he got an email from the AI that said, I'm out. I'm on the internet.
Well, that's again a great marketing story, of course.
It's a great marketing story, yeah. And it really is, and it's kind of all over Twitter because it's so vivid. But, again, I mean, if you're building a system that, you want to then sell to the Defense Department or the NSA and says, this is the thing that can actually automate computer hacking and help you break into foreign governments and steal all their secrets. If you're the guy who's in charge of buying that system for the NSA, you're like, that's impressive. Yeah. I'll take 10.
Yeah. There's a lady over there with the red on her. And then there's two more gentlemen I saw. And I think then it's...
So as you say, the timing for this is massively relevant, and it also almost feels prescient, not only of Claude, but of Anthropic to have actually withdrawn their support for the US military just a week before they went rogue with their tools.
Yeah.
And I was following some threads online indicating this is actually by some other people who follow AI events, that this might not be the first incident, because The Guardian also reported about indiscriminate targeting, or possibly insufficiently discriminate targeting by the Israeli government in Gaza, also on pattern recognition, but maybe the recognition of patterns aren't always sufficiently solid. So this means regardless of the power of the technology, it's about making people responsible and liable for its end behavior. Yeah. And if we take back, because I found it really interesting getting your historical context, this case that just happened with Meta, there was a law passed, I understood at one point, where they weren't made liable for what happened on their platform. There was a previous media law that set that precedent. And so we're actually kind of walking into the same mistake again, where we're not, like Anthropic actually anticipated it by withdrawing before they become liable. That we need to actually introduce this liability and introduce it quickly.
I think we got your drift.
Yeah, it's interesting timing for sure. And I don't know whether Anthropic thought by making the demands that they were going to make that they were going to then just eventually be kicked out of the Pentagon anyway, and maybe they were. But it does seem like this issue to me of like liability for the product is a really interesting one, because it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. If the company's attitude is, well, we just build it, you use it however you're going to use it. Anthropic seems to have been saying, now we want to set limits on how you can use it. And obviously the Defense Department said that's a no-go for us. But I was just very interested in that idea because I'm not used to companies setting like terms of service that go to the question of whether you can use this for lethal operations or not. That's a very interesting, provocative thing, it seems to me, that Anthropic did. I can't say whether it was for marketing purposes or for genuine, moral ones, but you saw the reaction when a company tried to tell the Pentagon, from its point of view, how you're going to fight wars. And the Pentagon's reaction was to essentially try and, nuke the company. I mean, make them unable of doing business in the United States. I mean, they took it to court and they won. It was a ridiculous case. But it makes me think that other companies will not be so quick to try and step up to the Pentagon and say, hey, we have concerns about how you're using this, because the Secretary of War, has demonstrated like we will completely go after your company and try and put you out of business if you do that.
There are two more questions. The last one in the front row and the last one, the penultimate one with the...
Yes, thank you. My question is, okay, so you mentioned that tech companies are increasingly involved in US government surveillance and military, but to what extent are those same companies lobbying and influencing American policymaking?
They are significantly, and have been for a long time. I can remember, actually, it was interesting when, I think it would have been in the 2008, 2009, it was not long after Obama was elected, and Google set up a Washington office specifically to talk about policy and to do, lobbying and to try and get to know lawmakers and influencers. And it was sort of this kind of signal moment where the tech companies realized that it's not enough to just sell the product of the government. You need to be in Washington influencing how the government makes decisions on what to buy and how to use it and where to invest money. And so all of them are heavily involved in that, whether it's outright lobbying or it's just different kinds of influence or getting to know people, becoming experts, testifying. One of the things that Palantir does is it has its employees, sit in the room essentially with the people in the military who are using the product because it's rather complicated. That's also a really good way of forging alliances with your customer and influencing how they think about it and what they might want. And they say, it'd be really great if the machine could do this. That's great. We'll get you an update. So yeah, they're very much, they're a fixture, these companies in Washington now. Whereas when I started reporting, they didn't have much of a presence. They didn't know how Washington worked. And now, they're everywhere. And like Google throws, they'll throw a big party for the White House Correspondents' Dinner in 2 weeks. And, they'll be testifying and they give money to think tanks. And, and they're not alone. I'm just picking on Google. But that is just a kind of way of life in Washington now. They've figured out how to influence people. And that is how the system works. And they've learned how to play it.
I think you have the last question, the gentleman in the front row here.
Hi, thank you so much for tonight. I have a question for you, being a research journalist and an American foremost. Is it harder for you to find news sources and information in, allied countries because of being from the States?
Is it hard for me to find sources in other countries?
No, in usually allied countries, because, the trust and the political climate as it is.
Oh, I see what you mean. I think it's actually the opposite. I find that people in other countries want to talk to an American journalist because A, they want to know what the hell's going on in America. And they're like, can you explain it? And they're worried. But also, I think that there are people who want to contribute their point of view, to get that across in American journalism. And, I have to say this, and I'm going to sound like like I'm being overly patriotic about this, but I said I'm an unapologetic Atlanticist, right? I mean, I believe in the NATO alliance. There are still people, in this country and in other countries in Europe who believe in preserving this alliance, and they are fighting really hard to try to do that. And I think, it makes it easier for me as a journalist because those people want to talk about what's important to them. Right, and they want to talk about the value of the alliance, and they want to get that value across. And I think that they see probably in me somebody who agrees with them fundamentally on that, right, and who values that as well. So, I mean, the time that we're in right now, as hard as it is for being Americans and knowing that people in Europe are looking at us like many of them and are shaking their heads and are very disappointed and very angry, actually ends up making people want to talk to me more, I think.
I think we draw into a close, which is a pity because I realize there are many more questions. Maybe some of them can be answered in the bar. We always have this extra opportunity. That depends, of course, on whether Shane Harris is still willing to spend time.
I told you I do my best work in bars, so that's totally, I'm down with it.
Or jet lagged so much that he needs to go home. It's a wonderful conversation, and we touched upon the surfaces of things which you could delve into for hours. I think this whole thing about the atomic, the comparison, the question about the atomic bomb and how this will influence us in the next decades to come, we don't know, but it's profound probably. I think it's amazing how this human intelligence finds new things which are immediately dangerous again. I think Walt Disney made a wonderful movie about it with Mickey Mouse and the sorcerer's apprentice. We're having an evening actually with the Nederlands Kamerkoor at the end of April, especially about this and Oppenheimer and the chorus having written new music and an opera on this topic, and talking to Robert Dijkgraaf, one of our main scientists, about that problem. So I hope to see you again here in the Balie. You can come every night, almost every night. And thank you very, very much, Shane Harris. A warm applause to you and sharing your insights with us. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. It was a privilege. Thank you.